Well, welcome everyone to our Bessie Conversations. And this week we'll be conversing about the topic of reparations, resolve, and restitution. We're very happy that you could join us. And we're going to get started. Just a reminder, next week the topic will be retention and race. So we're very much looking forward to that. And now we're going to ask Jacqueline Rose, BSU spokesperson, she's going to announce our winter quarter book club selection.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome this evening. I'm so excited to tell you that the book is going to be, if you haven't guessed it, I wish I had a drum roll, Project 19, the Project 1619 project is going to be our book this coming winter. And for those that don't know, it was introduced in the New York Times by Nicole Hannah-Jones. She actually got the 2021 Most Influential Person of the Year award for all that she's done on this project. That includes a number of essays and stories, and just goes back to relay the information and the history of slavery in this country, how it affects even up to today. So there's all these different writers that are involved in the book, including the poet laureate from the inauguration, and many, many others, outstanding names. I know some of you might remember Ibram Kendi being one of the books that we did last year, and he's also in the book, has a section in the book. But there's many, many authors that have all these various information and discussions on the impact of slavery in this country and how it affects generation after generation after generation and our societal makeup. So if you're looking forward to that, I am going to post in the chat a link to Essewan Books, because you know that's one of our favorite bookstores in Leimert Park in Los Angeles. And I'm going to put the link in the chat, so if you wanted to read through it, take a look and purchase your book for its upcoming debut. And enjoy. Thank you, Dr. Gills, for this opportunity. And also, don't forget the BSU meeting next Friday, November 12th at noon, and that information and email will go out as well for those that are here.
That sounds great. And we'll be sending reminders throughout this quarter and next, and we'll announce our conversationalists as we preview and converse about 1619 book. So I'm very happy to welcome Professor Amiri back, and we have a very warm new welcome to Terry Sivers, another professor that's going to converse with us about reparations. And we certainly know that that is a topic that's been in the national conversations about reparations, particularly in the last year and a half. A survey taken in 2020 stated that 75% of African Americans supported some form of reparations. However, in recent years, even though the number of other Americans supported reparations, 1 out of 5 said that they were not certain that the form of reparations should be monetary. So some of the things that issues that we're going to talk about today is what form of reparations. And in fact, even though there's a precedent reparations from the African diaspora, and here there seems to be not agreement about how that should in fact proceed. Should it be monetary? Should it be a holistic approach? So I think both of our conversationalists are going to bring forth some very, very interesting and engaging, a very rich conversation. Please notice their bios, but they're going to say a little bit about themselves, and we hope to have a very generous conversation. And please put your questions and comments in the chat, and David will be facilitating, and so we're looking forward. And why don't you start, Amiri, and welcome back.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. Thank you for the invite. Peace, everyone. My name is Amiri Mahnzili, as mentioned. I'm a professor of Pan-African Studies at Cal State University of Los Angeles. Also at Cerritos College, I teach their African Studies program as well there. Graduate student in the PhD program at Claremont Graduate University in Cultural Studies with a focus on Africana studies. One thing I do want to know, because I think it's important to how I'll be approaching this conversation, I consider myself a Pan-Africanist. The theories that I often work through is the theory of Pan-Africanism, which is understanding the unity and the similarities of African people throughout the diaspora and focusing on that opposed to the differences. So that's going to really ground my understanding of this, how I understand this conversation. It's going to kind of guide the way I move through the conversation. Outside of that, I'll just kind of let the conversation do what it does, and I'll let Terry go ahead and say a few things about himself.
Greetings, everyone. Again, my name is Terry, and I'm fortunate enough to be here, part of this conversation. Thank you, Amiri. Thank you, Dr. Gills, and the folks involved in putting this this conversation together. I am a current PhD student in education at part of the joint doctoral program between San Diego State University and Claremont Graduate University. At Claremont, I just recently received a second master's in cultural studies. I have a MS in counseling therapy, and my undergraduate work was in Africana studies. So I'm currently a community college counselor, adjunct counselor, and instructor as well. So again, thank you all for having me.
So when Dr. Gills approached me with this subject of conversation, and she asked me who I thought would be a good conversationalist, Terry was the first person that popped into my mind just through conversation that we had throughout seminars. And I knew that he did a really profound conference through San Diego State University on the concept and the conversation around reparations. If you don't mind, Terry, can you kind of provide a little bit of background about that conference?
Yeah, absolutely. The conference took place in the spring of 2020. And the purpose was basically to bring together a survey of the land. Survey of the landscape, basically Black folks from different areas, from different, from political arenas, from academic arenas, from folks, from activists, folks from, again, different arenas, basically bringing us together to articulate, the continued demand by Black people for reparations. So that was basically just a survey of the land, and basically, again, to articulate the demand by Black folks across the field, a shared demand for reparations. And again, the question on the table was not so much, whether or not Black people, want reparations, but so much what the question on the table had much more to do with the others, other folks, non-Black folks, and their willingness to address, the history and the continued trauma experienced by Black people that today we even protest about around, the issue of Black Lives Matter, with the recent protests. So there seemed to be this wave of this spirit of change. But, my question remained the same, to what extent is society really ready to address this history?
And then also, one of the things too, Terry, like he's being very modest about the conference, because there were some really heavy hitters who he gathered and brought out. One of them being Frank Wilderson. Can you kind of explain to the audience who Frank Wilderson is? Why is he important to your research and your methodology and approach to research?
Yeah, Frank was one of for me, he's instrumental to this conversation in terms of answering the question or thinking about the question. But I was able to bring together Ta-Nehisi Coates, current Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, Frank Wilderson, Dr. Ray Wimbush, again, folks from across different areas and arenas to basically engage in this conversation. And what Frank addresses in his work, he offers a diagnosis of the problem that most are really, that's unsettling. It's a unsettling set of assumptions that he operates from that suggest, as he would say, that the world isn't going to offer redress for Black pain and suffering. That people, non-Black people, are incapable of doing such, because by suggesting reparations for Black people is a threat to their existence on a psychic level. It would cause an existential crisis to the very notion of self, of who I as a non-Black person think I am, or say that I am, and can articulate who I am through violence against Black people. Now, this is across, in our contemporary day of identity politics, which, this is across all identity formations, whether that be past, present, or future identity formations that seem to be being invented as we speak, on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I definitely want to go a little bit deeper into that, because I see where the conversation is going. But before we do that, I do want to provide like a working definition of reparations, so we don't assume that everyone online knows what reparations is. How would you define or conceptualize this notion of reparations?
Well, my work kind of is in the line with Frank, and that has to do with a lot of my history and my relationship to I would say whiteness as a child, as a product of a mixed race coupling. I learned at a very early age that my race, that blood wasn't thicker than water. So that's kind of where my interests lie. But in terms of a working definition, I definitely borrow from folks who are on the ground, who are doing the work, thinking about and imagining what reparations would look like for Black people. And it's definitely a holistic approach. It's one that's gonna take time, years and years and years of investment, not only economically but psychologically, educationally. It's a holistic approach and again, I'm taking that from those like Sandy Darity or Antonio Moore and Yvette Carnell, and folks who are really invested in imagining what reparations would look like.
And then, so you mentioned Frank a few times, and when I hear Frank Wilderson, I think automatically this notion or this idea, Afro-pessimism. How does Afro-pessimism understand or inform your understanding of reparations, the possibilities of reparations? You kind of touched on it a little bit already, but if you kind of dive a little bit deeper on that for me.
Well, a lot of reparations agendas are predicated or assuming the goodwill of non-Black people.
Right.
And that's ahistorical. But we continue and have continued to assume the goodwill of non-Black people, that they say Black Lives Matter. Liberals talk, we live in the most liberal state in the union, but yet we incarcerate the most people. There's the most police, death, murders of Black people in this state. And we talk about homelessness, but we talk about this is the most liberal state in the union, right? So it's a really just acceptance of the non-Black. It's a reality. It's an acceptance of the system as currently constructed, as people operating within the system is completely constructed, and it's accepting the reality for what it is. That, and for my, drawing from my experience, I was raised up until about the age of 5 by my white mother. It was shared custody, but one day my mother left me at the babysitter's house and never came back. And then, when I was about in my early 20s, I had a conversation with her about why. Well, she basically shared. I didn't ask, but she shared why she left me and my siblings at the babysitters, and she said she didn't know how to raise black children. So for me, again, when I say blood is not thicker than water, from my experience, it's taught me that the deep nature of race and anti-Black racism in our society, that even the traditional relationships, those that we assume to be natural, the relationship between mother and child, race just throws those things into chaos.
Yeah. For me, one of the things, and I mentioned this earlier, and I'll kind of go into it now, but coming into Claremont, I was familiar with this notion or this idea of Afro-pessimism, but in conversation with you through seminar, I got a deeper understanding of it. And one of the things I do find generative in the work of Wilderson, he takes this idea or this notion of African people, Black folks being non-human. He really situates himself in there, and he uses this idea and he kind of uses it as a field of play. And I liken that to the work of, Fanon and this notion of the zone of non-being, Edward Glissant and this idea of the abyss, right? And these thinkers who are able to kind of sit in these paradigms, although they may be uncomfortable, although they may be untrue, right? And really make work from them in production from them. And I think what's interesting when you think about reparations from an Afro-pessimistic standpoint, right? It becomes almost oxymoronic, because how do you pay a debt to someone who's not human, right? And then on the polar side or the opposite side of that spectrum, I think about thinkers like Fred Moten, who kind of situates this idea of reparation as a debt that cannot be repaid, right? Mm-hmm. So we have like these two polarizing ideals. And for me, I lean more towards Moten's idea, to where out of all the things that the Black body has been through, there is no monetary, there's no compensation for the centuries of oppression, degradation, and just shit that we had to deal with, right? So I think Afro-pessimism does offer a fecund way to look at our experiences as Black folks within the society. But I think it's also also important to understand, one, Blackness is not a monolith, right? And I think one of the important and generative things about bringing you into conversation today is the audience will be able to see two different interpretations of Blackness and two different interpretations of how we think about reparations. So I think that's very helpful. So as we get to this idea of reparations and this notion of either the debt that can't be repaid or paying people who are not human, right? I question for you as a Pan-Africanist, where do you see Africa within the role of reparations, or the African diaspora?
Well, you just shared a lot in that. There's a lot to unpack in what you just shared, and reparations. Afro pessimists would definitely agree. It's definitely beyond repair. Even if we can, how do we imagine? There's nothing equivalent to this pain and suffering that Black folk have been through. This reduction to non-human status, to animals, to property, that continues to be the driving force for how we think about Black people today. One of the things that we have to, that I find most fecund about Frantz Fanon and Black Skin and White Mask is how he's able to articulate the Black body within this structure, between the libidinal economy. Because I feel like it's hard when the measuring stick has been whiteness, right, for so long, or proximity to master's house, or proximity to whiteness. It's hard for us to register anti-Black violence when it's situated like in the house, or situated within these institutions where, we talk about privilege. Everybody has privilege. But how do you explain anti-Blackness and the production of anti-Blackness even in those spaces? And with Fanon's notion of the libidinal economy, he allows us to be able to articulate that experience within that same framework of anti-Blackness through negrophilia. So we talk about the phobic response to Blackness that's generally associated with masculinity, which today through, but well, I won't go into the Black masculine and stuff, but but today somehow, that historical, monster, that historical trope of, Black, the Black boogeyman has become a symbol of toxic masculinity and across in many disciplines. And it's unfortunate because that robs us, we're robbing us of a humanity, robbing us of our victimization. And so, but again, we see the violence on Black bodies. Generally, it's kind of, the energy kind of revolves around the Black masculine body with the police violence. But how do we articulate the violence that people experience when they're in proximity to whiteness? The psychological effects that we don't really recognize as violence, because the measuring stick has been now proximity to whiteness, and it's unfortunate. And again, I don't know if having a relationship with white people throughout my life, my relative, people I love and closest to me are white, and it taught me a valuable lesson that even the greatest of and most well-intentioned white people aren't gonna, our self-preservation is still ultimately going to be their directive, their drive. Maybe it's conscious or unconscious, but they're not gonna do anything to jeopardize really their existence in the world.
I think it's interesting because if you look globally, reparations are kind of being passed out and sparsed out. And you can even go outside of the African community, and there's a historical precedent for reparations. The Native communities receive reparations. The Jewish community are still receiving reparations from the United States to this day. And then I look at, for example, the situation in Africa where they're trying to get their goods back, their artifacts back, and things of that nature. I view that as a form of reparations, right? I'm on board with that, but it's not really picking up steam on U.S. soil, right? You hear the conversations, like no politician this summer could have any conversation around Blackness without facing this notion of reparations. But when it comes time to really doing something, nothing moves. So why is the situation, in your opinion, for Africans here in America different when it comes to this question of reparations?
Well, you throw some salt, good stuff. So we're going, okay. So you talked about Africa, the diaspora, and that was the question you asked prior, and I didn't really address that question, and but it ties into this question, and now there's a lot of tension in terms of how there's a grassroots kind of movement toward by folks like Antonio Moore and Yvette Carnell, the ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves Camp ADOS. Tariq Nasheed, he's kind of taken from that, and he's calling it foundational Black. But there's this notion today within Black thought and Black activism around kind of how we're thinking about reparations as it applies to different Black bodies, whether that be U.S. situated Black bodies and Caribbean and African. And I don't think that it runs contrary to Pan-Africanism. I think it actually can work to support Pan-Africanism as we tackle the giants where we are. For descendants of slaves here in the United States, our giant, our Goliath isn't the French per se, or it's the United States of America, and maybe at some point Great Britain, but it's the United States of America. Whereas for Jamaicans, their giant is Great Britain, and colonies, were French colonies or Belgian colonies, that's their giant. So actually, I think this idea of really being empathetic to the grounds in which we, to our lineage. This is a term that really is drawn from ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves. But if really being empathetic to the lineage could really provide a resource for us to tackle the giants where we are, and hopefully topple the whole damn thing. That's the goal, and so I hope that.
Yeah, it does. And to be honest with you, Terry, like I'm very familiar with the ADOS movements. I have my qualms with them, to say the least. Honestly, I think you articulated this notion of reparations for me more comprehensively than I've heard any other members of that segment kind of speak about this notion. Because when I hear their rhetoric, it seems very divisive and very anti-Pan-African, in the sense that they want to separate experience here in America juxtaposed to throughout the diaspora. And then just the whole title itself, I can't get with that, right? This idea of being descendants of slaves. Slavery was an experience. It's not an ontological understanding of who you are. So, I have to, but that's, semantics. So in your vision of reparations, which stems from this notion of 40 acres and a mule, do you see this idea being a monetary exchange? How do you, if we are to have this take place in a ideal world, what would that exchange look like in your eyes?
It's really not like you said, and piggybacking from taking from Moten, it's not fair to try to quantify this Black pain and suffering. It really does it a disservice when you try to articulate it. I don't know. It does. You're right. It doesn't sit right with me. Whether it's a 15 to $20 trillion, which most serious folks who are invested in this research have determined, but even that you can't. There's no number that can really repair the damage done to Black people. Talking about the Ma'afa, where where Black folk, or folks who are now called Black, which again we're taken from Afro-pessimism, but folks now called Black were completely disconnected from their own ways of being in the world, and forced into the slave ships, and forced into these plantations, and forced into Jim Crow, and forced into now forced into this weird color blindness that we're in right now, this weird space that we're in right now, where we're seeing black death is so visible, but yet we're seeing demonstrations of Black success everywhere. So it's just this weird space that we're in right now, that we probably won't really understand the significance of what's happening until 50 years from now. We look back at this time and be like, damn, how did Black people survive this shit? It's Black trauma always exists in the past. It's never realized in the present. Right. And it, and that's just how normal our death is. But yeah, 40, at a minimum, my mind, I do see, and this is where I differ from Dr. Frank Wilderson, is I do see a time when a political party uses reparations to support their agenda, where they'll just and I think it will probably come from the Republican or the Conservative Party, who will piggyback on their ties to Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, and basically use it as a political move to gain power, to win over Black votes. And really it offers breadcrumbs, if anything. And unfortunately, some of us will, that's why I really appreciate Afro-pessimism, because it really challenges us to continue to think through these things in a way that forces us to check ourselves and what it is that's really happening.
When I think about reparations and I think about the title, for me, it invokes the work of James Baldwin. And reason being, Baldwin often focuses on not with the system of what many call white supremacy, what I'll call white inferiority, does to Black folks, right? But Baldwin looks at how it also affects white folks, those who occupy white bodies, right? So if we are to kind of apply that approach and look at reparations in the same regard, one of the things I think that reparations can do, while it cannot repay this debt, it acknowledges what took place, right? I think it will set the grounds for some type of resolution, some type of resolve, some type of healing. I don't think it will be complete, but at least that acknowledgement, right, will kind of get the ball rolling. And I think most importantly, it allows for this notion that Baldwin is really keen on, the maintenance of white innocence, right? How white people just want to cling to their innocence. Giving reparations will allow for this mystic idea of their innocence to be dispelled, right? Because they have to acknowledge, yes, I'm paying you out because of what we did as a people to your people. So while we focus on what reparations can do for African people, I think one of the ways of looking at it that could be very, very fecund and generative is how we could begin to free the soul of those white folks who have been hampered and haunted by this their whole existence, right? Because and Baldwin does this very well. You look at books like Going to Meet the Man, you look at Giovanni's Room, right? White folks are affected by this notion of white inferiority just as much, or some would argue even more damaging than Black folks are, right? So I think this is a component of the conversation that on a national level that never gets talked about, right? And I think if more attention were to be paid toward that, even for white folks to hear, well, damn, maybe this is my way of starting to try to heal myself, right? Although it may be self-serving, right? But at least it kind of gets that ball rolling, gets the conversation started, and gets them at least to think and puts them in a place where they have to deal with the stuff that they threw, right? So I think that's interesting.
And that's why you're the optimist.
Yeah, you know me, bro. Yeah, you know, I'm always on that. I'm a radical optimist. Right?
Okay,
yeah, absolutely. But within my optimism, I don't know in my lifetime at least if we'll see reparations. I don't know if my kids will see reparations. So my approach has been to steal it whenever I can. And you know, when I get, I'm going to get my bag, and that's my way of getting my reparations, right? And I'll be damned if someone tells me no, right? And that's, to me, that's the only resolve that we have at this point to take, because I don't have faith in the government. I don't have faith in those who occupy white bodies to come to the realization of, oh yeah, let's give this up. That's not how it works. In my estimation, power only understands and recognizes power. So as an offense, I think we should be moving from that standpoint instead of always being on the defensive. How are we looking on time? Because I know it's about 4.
I was just going to say this is a good break time. This has been quite enriching. I would encourage everyone to put their questions and comments in the chat. I think we have some now, so we can open to the audience. And David,
Yo,
how are we looking?
we got a lot of great questions. So let's get started with that. First, just thank you so much for the conversation thus far, and especially the differences in perspective that just hones things in this beautiful kind of way. So thank you for that. Dr. Sam Scales, you're still here, has a question about what reparations would look like in a practical sense. Dr. Sam Scales, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, yes. Thank you guys so much for hosting this, and thanks for inviting me to this. Terry, I posted a question here and just so you guys know, I was in the joint doctoral program at San Diego State and Claremont Graduate University with Terry. Terry was my mentee when he came to San Diego State, and you know, it's tough trying to get rid of him, so he's still around me. But my question for you, Terry, is, and it's pretty simple and straightforward. What would paying reparations look like for African Americans here? What form would that take?
Well, I would say there's a litany of resources I'm going to direct you to, including the ADOS website, including the work of Dr. Sandy Darity, the work of Raymond Winbush, in Cobra. They're doing work with reparations out of the Caribbean. I think it's called Caribicom or something like that. But they're articulating again a reparations agenda out of the Caribbean. So there are folks who are doing that work, and I would direct you to them in terms of and then the different legislation here in California. What's interesting is the legislation on just studying the controversy on around just studying reparations. It's like, it's so trivial. It's like, how is, I mean, in this moment in time of Black Lives Matter, it's plastered everywhere. Just even having a conversation around reparations is trivial. I mean, if anybody tuned into the public hearings on reparations in California, I believe it's AB 3121. I mean, the way that the analysis that Black folks are doing to show the continued oppression and systematic anti-Black violence being targeted, it's in housing, education. I mean, it's like we're doing the work. I mean, goddamn, I don't want to, anyway. I mean, folks are, anyway.
But just if I can throw in though, I do think they need to cut a check, and I think they need to come up off some land. Like just to put it bluntly, right? Like I need some cash in my account, and I need some land to work off of. I think that's the minimum, right? Like that's just to start the conversation. You need to start it with that, and then we can build off from there.
I was hoping that something would come about when we talked about giving reparations with the HBCUs here, because to actually physically, and this is just my point of view, to actually physically give someone a check, what are they going to do with those checks? Go right back and turn around and spend it on cars, shoes, or whatever, and the money's going right back to where it comes from. So my idea was doing something for the HBCUs where African-American children for the next 50 years could go to those schools for free and have those schools be funded by the government.
Yeah, I mean, I like that, right? But maybe again, it's the radical optimism in me. I don't necessarily know that we all gonna get that money back, right? Although habits have shown that we typically do that. But I do believe there is a change in consciousness. Black businesses have boomed over the last summer, right? So I do think there's a shift, and hopefully that will not be the case. But at the same time, I don't believe that negates what needs to be done for us, right? Like that should be done regardless of what we're gonna do with it. That's our decision to do what we do with our money. What it's for is for what was done to us. And I don't think that negates them cutting that check just because we may give it back, right?
Yeah, and in terms of a dollar amount, I think the numbers for, again, American descendants or descendants of slaves here in the United States, that comes out to about $250,000 or so per descendant of slave.
Thank you. Jacqueline Rose has a question about that involves Haiti. Jacqueline?
Actually, everybody kind of answered that question in the discussion, because previously you were discussing how to put a monetary value on it. When it seems like when in reverse, when we're putting a monetary value on us as chattel, it seems very easy to do. Now, when it's being paid back, no one knows how to do an Excel spreadsheet that's based off of chattel. So I find it very difficult to take it in. I'm sorry. I try to, but at the same time, I know people will utilize that money because some people need shoes and some people need food, and that money is going to be to move around within society. At the same time, it's the societal differences that we want to see. It's the laws that are part of that, should be a part of that reparation process, because of the lack of ability to generate a wealth and the lack of ability to generate good schools and art and Black neighborhoods, and the lack of, the list goes on for the lack of, which involves a lot more than just the monetary value. And people get stuck so much in that. I'm just wondering if there is a way to say, like with the HBCUs and other programs and other laws that could come about that would make a great difference in the general society for African Americans and the others, especially since they're doing it for the others already. Do you see something like that? Can you put words to that?
I think it would be, I think it's necessary, and I think it's nice, and I like what you're saying. But one thing I kind of picked up on when you talked about Haiti, and Haiti is very interesting when you especially talking about reparations, because one, it's the first Black nation to successfully get rid of slavery, right? Enslavement. Because of that act, they're paying the French,
Okay, that's
right? So when you're talking about Haiti and reparations, I mean, to me, that's a good starting point, right? Because they're still paying for their act of revolution. They're still paying for actuating Blackness, right? They're still paying for not being subservient, right? So one, haven't stopped paying. That's a great way to start for their Black people in that reparations, right? Shit, France should be paying Haiti reparations. That's another way that you could think about reparations for the Haitian people, right? And I think just as a whole, for Black folks, for the Black nation, we need to give Haiti its proper respect and its proper due, because they tick the first domino over, right? And a lot of the freedoms, the liberties that we are able to experience would not be if it was not for Haiti, you know? So I really love the fact that you centralize Haiti in this conversation of reparations, because I don't think we should really have a conversation about reparations and not have Haiti involved in that conversation.
Okay, thank you. Having trouble reading my notes. Tamala Takahashi has a couple of questions actually about how this plays out on different levels in community, and then also a question about whether or not affirmative action was a kind of reparations. Tamala, you want to ask your questions?
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. This is my first messy conversation. It's been so informative, and I really appreciate it. So I work mainly on the city level and with the Jedi work. And one of the things that we're struggling with here is, this idea of reparations on a city level. After having done a proclamation, the city's done a proclamation of being a sundown town, having been a sundown town. And we also were a red line city. But, it just isn't enough, right? It's great that I did that proclamation, but we're trying to figure out, like, how can we make really actionable items to do reparations locally? And so that made me think of maybe there's different kinds of reparations that can be done at different levels. So there's a federal level and a state level and a city level, and even like county and organizational and all that. So could you speak potentially to that, how on the ground in a local community reparations might look different than, say, at a federal or state level?
At my conference, we had Alderman Rue Simmons out of Illinois, who's basically they passed legislation for a reparations legislation in their city. I believe it's Evanston. So I would definitely say she would be a resource you can turn to. I would also say, if there's your constituents, those, for me, those would be the voices within your jurisdiction that you would need to talk to in terms of what reparations would look like for them on the ground. Of course, there's state and federal implications that need to be considered, but that some of that is out of your control. But what is in your control, and what are the limits? And for me, it's about what are you willing to sacrifice in order to make this a reality? And it's those limitations. I remember I was kind of interested in pursuing. I was talking to a young lady, a white woman, and romantically, and she was woke, and she brought up this. We went down this rabbit hole, and she was like, "Well, at the end of it, what is it that you want? What is it that Black people want?" And I was like, "Well, what if you, what if you just sign over your trust fund to a Black organization, and also, gift your house to a Black person?" And her response was, "Well, Black people sold other Black people into slavery." So, at some point, the cost is too much to bear for most. And I'm of the, based upon my experience and based upon my just reading of history, at some point that cost is too much for all. And so that's that's where.
I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong, David Tripp. I thought you heard the question of is affirmative action a form of reparations?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was my second question.
I did. No, it's not. Right. Like, let's put a historical context on what affirmative action was. Right. Because of the mistreatment of African people here within the United States, they wanted to put some laws on the books that would allow that to not be permissible. Right. So that's what affirmative action was about. To me, that's a separate conversation from all the damage that we've done to you for centuries. Affirmative action works, it addresses one specific atrocity that was caused, right? Not the entirety of the thing. And again, the reparations can't even address that, right? Even if we were to pay them out, we can't address that. So no, I think we need to separate the two. I think it's dangerous to try to link affirmative action to a form of reparations. That lets the state off the hook, right? That's a great way to absolve white guilt. Well, we gave you affirmative action, and at the same time, we're trying to take affirmative action away, right? So no, it's not. And I don't even know how effective affirmative action was at repaying that debt.
It was effective for white women, and it's crazy that today somehow Black men are positioned. They're the position of Black men to white women. Where this notion of gender pay gap, and gender inequality generally doesn't include the Black men, where we assume that white women make more money and make less money and worth less money than Black men. Like it's just yeah. So affirmative action did benefit folks, and it generally benefited white women who are now within these institutions of education in way higher numbers than they were before.
Thank you. I also want to thank everybody who's putting so many fantastic resources in the chat. It was really rich to mine that. So follow along there. A couple more questions. Gabriel has a question about the relationship between reparations and systemic change. Gabriel?
Yeah, I see reparations as a necessary act of justice in terms of its monetary form. But I see that also kind of affirming an individualistic narrative, and it kind of it doesn't address systemic and structural issues that perpetuate and maintain Black violence in every part of our society, socially, structurally. And so, yeah, I was just wondering whether what political action, if political action is included in reparations.
I agree with you, Gabriel, right? Like, I don't think that reparations will stop police brutality. No, it's two separate conversations. But I do think a monetary exchange can improve the material living conditions of the people, right? I do think if that monetary exchange was organized and done effectively, it can create some type of systemic difference in the sense that it kind of gives us a groundwork to, I don't know, if you want to make an exodus, we can do that. We have the financial resources to do so. If you wanted to pull the community together and create our own separate type of community, we have the resources to do that. So I think it can create a condition to where you see some structural difference. I don't know if it's changed, but fundamentally, I have to agree with you. I don't believe if reparations were paid yesterday that police brutality will stop, right? I don't believe if reparations were paid yesterday that the anti-Blackness in the education system will stop, right? They're mutually exclusive. So I think you're very attentive in your analysis of this. But I think this is one of the many things that we have to deal with as African people within this society. But again, what reparation does do is the acknowledgement, right? It's the fact that yes, we're owning up to something that was done that was not supposed to be done. Boom. So that would work, but I agree. I don't think that it's going to give us this total structural systemic change.
But it will allow us, let's say, best case scenario, to sit at the table and not dependent on other people.
Yeah.
No form of political power that we don't have that's tied to the economic realities of the world that we live on, that move, follow the money.
Yeah.
I at my program, I initially wanted to bring representatives from the Nation of Islam, Black nationalist organization known as Uhuru, who first introduced me to the conversation of reparations. But some members of the Jewish community, they deemed that these folks were anti-Semitic, preaching hate speech and anti-Semites, and I had to remove these people from my program. And again, reparations would give us a form of political power that we don't have, because there's dollars behind it. There's dollars behind us.
So you guys are doing an amazing job of fielding balls hit to all fields. There's no end of where the questions are coming from. Monique Bowen has a comment, not so much a question, but it fits beautifully into where we are at this moment. Monique, would you like to bring your comment into the conversation?
Hi, David, thank you. And Terry and Amiri, thank you both for really engaging this topic at such a grassroots and intellectual level. Like, it's really bridging a continuum. It's really important and necessary, I think, if we're going to have a real conversation about these issues, which we are. So I really appreciate it. I wish more people were here. The thing that I was just saying in response to Gabriel's comment, and he and I had a brief exchange after, had to do with monetary investment being a requisite for working toward systemic change. That, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, there's a mobilization, there's a influence set of campaigns that has to occur to change minds, right? And so that costs money. And you made points earlier about power being central to much of what we're talking about, and power speaking to power. And I, as a psychologist, sort of shiver at even having said that, but it is a type of truth. It's not the truth in all on all accounts and in all settings, but it certainly is powerful. That's the reality in a lot of ways. And so, I'm having so many thoughts. A lot of it is actually focused on language. And, I always, when I'm having my most sort of conflictual set of thoughts and going back and forth with myself about something, I just try to break things down quite a bit, and just thinking about what is reparation, and even being a bit more simplistic about what it would take to repair one's relationship to another person, to a family, to a community. I think this is why Bronfenbrenner came to mind when Tamala mentioned these systems and layers, but that this requires, multi-layered, active, focus on the word active, response in order to have a experience of a shift, an experience of change. And so what is it for me to repair something with one other person versus a family versus a community? And maybe that community is like, a 2-block radius. What does it look like with the people you live with and see the most? What is it within a school or in a classroom? and one-on-one with a teacher where there's been harm done. And so much of this is personal. And so that's why I really appreciated, Terry, you starting out, the beginning of this talk, making it about your own family and your own growing up experience, because I do think that for each of us, we have to start thinking about repair and what makes it hard for us to accept that there could be a way to make less painful this incredibly painful experience for our country. And we keep, doubling down on those experiences and worsening conditions by refusing to have these conversations in earnest. The levers that get pushed and pulled, and the fear and animosity that gets stirred have a lot to do with the personal. And so I'm very interested in thinking about this from a systems point of view and using what we do know that maybe is common parlance to change the narrative from being very focused on you're getting something that I don't get. When the premise of that idea that that's what reparations is a problem. So I'll stop.
I'll just say, I've been called the N-word by probably way more poor white people than rich white people. And because when you were talking, Monique, it got me to thinking about what is like Baldwin talks about why was the Negro created or invented, and the Negro was invented in Afro-pessimists working through the work of I'm blanking on the name. Orlando Patterson. They get us to thinking away from this economic basis of slavery, and more to this question of ontology. But Sylvia Winter talks about this as well in terms of, again, the purpose of the Negro isn't necessary. It is to search or to heal relationships between non-Black people. It's to search or relationships between the white poor and the white rich. Search or relationships now between white men and white women. Search or relationships, heal relationships between, let's say, white homosexuals and white heterosexuals. That's the purpose, because one, they all have an agreed upon, consented upon enemy, which is Blackness. So, in terms of, again, looking at this, the ecological systems model, right? If Black power is a threat to that model, for me, which tells me it will never be a reality. And the only way we can make it a reality, which Frantz Fanon talks about, is through violence. Unfortunately, we can't have those conversations. So we have to talk about this more subtly in terms of, can we introduce something symbolically? Can we introduce a word? And can we introduce the microaggressions or white fragility, or what we're gonna call it, something, introduce something to change into the consciousness that will change people's behavior. I know that CBT, right? We can change behavior by changing thoughts. But if we're talking about something that exists pre-consciously, we're not even aware of this directive of violence towards Blackness. And again, history, for all intents and purposes, and I don't want to be, historicist and say it's totalizing, but history is the evidence that we have. And again, for me, my lived experience is the evidence I have that leads me to, towards Afro-pessimism.
Yeah, I would love to spend a lot of time talking with you about all that you just said. I guess I would just add that you talked about Fanon and his reference to violence as a attention to this issue, and creating kind of a clearing for some other activity. And I think that conversation like this and shifting thoughts and ideas is violent too. Mm-hmm. Those sort of core beliefs is really, a big part of what we're talking about. And it's It's not solely an American condition, what we're talking about. Which is what we're very good at as a country, more and more over the decades and centuries, and we're becoming way more closed in some ways politically. And we can look at the alignment or lack of alignment around the climate movement right now, and the frank efforts to limit our ability to have a planet on the part of this elected government, like our survival. So it's talk about repair and reconciliation with the earth before we can even necessarily live the promise of a monetary or educational or psychotherapeutic reparative process. Will we be able to go outside 8 months out of the year, depending on where you live in this country, based on the amount of heat, in 10 years? So, there's like an order of operations that has to occur. But thank you.
If I could chime in, this idea of healing, and kind of take it back to the work that Baldwin does too. I would place that conversation on those who occupy white bodies. They need to heal within themselves. There need to be some healing done, right? There needs to be that Baldwinian notion of love that needs to take place internally with them, so they can understand why this is the way it is, right? Like, to me, you're not going to fault the victim of the rape. You're going to fault the perpetrator of the rape, right? So if you're going to use that analogy, white folks are going to have to kind of come to some healing, so that way everyone could heal, right? Because it's hard as a victim to try to situate, and to be fair, we do a very good job of this, right? As victims, we find ways to forgive. We find ways to extend hugs. We find ways to turn the other cheek, right? And that's gotten us nowhere. Just to be 100 about it, right? Let's just keep it 100% real. It hasn't gotten us nowhere. So for me, this notion of healing, it needs to be an internal process that's done within those that occupy white bodies, so that way the world can heal, right? That way the planet could heal, right? Like, to me, that's where it would have to start, because even we can't even talk about history because they don't want us to talk about real history. They're actively taking away the process of us learning about real history because it's critical race theory, so they call it, right? Like, how are we going to move forward if you can't truthfully deal with your past? And to me, that's the type of healing that needs to take place to move society forward.
I want to recognize that we usually formally end around 5 o'clock, and we've reached that time. We also usually hang out for another 20 minutes or so if Amiri and Terry are willing to do so, and allow the conversation to continue. There's a few people who didn't get their questions in, Asa and Nicole and myself. So if Asa and Nicole can hang out, we'll get to you. If you have to leave, be sure and join us next week as we think together about issues of retention and race. Should be a terrific conversation. Thank you all for being here. So I want to next turn to Asa, because Asa's question brings in the work in South Africa around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Asa.
Thank you. Oh, wait. I don't know if can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you both so much. I have a lot of names written down to follow up on, a lot of things to look up now, and a lot of information. But my question was, actually, you were just kind of touching on it in your last comment around a truth and reconciliation process, what that looks like in a country where we're so far from seeming to be able to even recognize basic fundamental truths about our history. Like, how do we get to a point where we can do something like, you know, the South Africa's process for truth and reconciliation, or a number of nations have gone through similar processes, when it seems like we're this kind of outlier, unable to deal with our own history. And I know it's a tough question. I don't expect you to have, the solution, but it's what I'm dealing with.
I think it's a good question, Asa. Really, you always ask good questions, bro. But to me, I don't know if South Africa's the model. I don't know if that's
Why not, Amiri? Why not, Amiri?
Well, so there's this idea of reconciliation in South Africa, right? Like, so that was a 7-year process, right? So yeah, we recognize we messed up, but like, be cool for 7 years, and then we'll address the grievances after the 7-year cooling off period, right? And if you look in South Africa, who has all the best parts of the land? Who has all the resources, right? So to me, South Africa is not necessarily the ideal solution I'm working towards, right? Because I'll be damned if you ask me to wait 7 years. I've been waiting over 700 years. Now another 7, that's not gonna work, right? So again, I'm thinking about how can we radically reimagine a newness that hasn't been done before, right? Because what's been on the ground and what's been done, to me, is not sufficient, right? So I'm thinking a lot more grandiose and a lot more bigger than examples like South Africa, et cetera,
And I think the notion of identities coming up for me in this idea, like Monique had mentioned, the symbolics, as long as whiteness exists symbolically, I don't know if there can really ever be any true reconciliation. I don't know what that means for white bodies, but symbolically, and in this age of identity information, the model in which we're operating from is whiteness. So all, here in San Diego, I grew up in in the city. In the 80s, 90s, it was a city part of town, and then the LGBT community started coming in, and now it looks it's one of the best parts of San Diego. But the model for how we are the model for our identities, even as they operate, is whiteness. So what is whiteness? Whiteness is terror to Black folks. So if you think about does there in, let's say, the LGBT space, or again, we're talking about emerging identities, and the model for emerging identities is whiteness. And so whatever that model is, all other subsequent identities are just going to perpetuate. So we're talking about, again, the taking of Native American land and anti-Blackness, which within certain spaces may be reproduced as, again, the fear of Blackness, or this fetishization of the Black body, which in, let's say, the LGBT community comes in the form of the big Black cock, which in some, again, strange Black Mirror type of way is seen as like a good thing. Like, oh, hey, white people fetish my body now, or white people can fetish bodies openly and it'd be okay. It's like, we're in this weird time. I don't know how to explain it. But for me, the question, again, the model, whether it's symbolically or materially, we have to, our intervention, whatever that might be, has to address both.
And I think you bring up a really good point that I don't want to get glossed over, like the idea of whiteness, the symbolic notion of whiteness, right? Like, is very different from white people. Right. And I think that's a very clear distinction that needs to be made, because even Black folks fall victim to this idea, the symbolic notion of whiteness. Right. And I think that's a really good point that you bring up, Terry. And I think it needs to kind of be focused on a little bit more because, oftentimes what happens, the two get conflated. And when they think about this notion of whiteness, you think of white people, and it's not necessarily the case. Right. Like, there's a difference and there's a distinction. And I think that distinction is very important.
And what not whiteness or non-Blackness can do for white bodies, it can't do for Black bodies, and never will. But the reality is, unfortunately, that model, unfortunately, is going to preserve, as we attempt to articulate Blackness, affirm Blackness with whiteness as its model. Unfortunately, it's going to affirm the very thing we're trying to address. And that's just the, again, Black Mirror. This is a 400, 500 year, or even longer if we go back to the Arab slave trade of Africa, of African people. I mean, a 1600-year Black Mirror episode of Black Mirror.
Thank you. And Nicole had a few questions and comments. Hard for me to summarize, but Nicole, would you like to bring those into the conversation?
First of all, I'd just like to say thank you, Amiri and Terry. And who says we don't need racial critical theory in education right now? This is definitely an example of that. These conversations need to be had. I just think that reparations is, added on to the complexity of, the damage that slavery, and as a result of slavery, a failed Reconstruction period too. And then trying to figure out how to handle society now where, as you said, Terry, it's all in relation to whiteness, but whiteness is complicated because of the love of Black culture as well. And that kind of gets mixed in and it confuses even Black people at times. So I think these conversations are just great. I just don't believe in reparations because there's so much stuff to work on before that. And reparations would just kind of be the final admission of those atrocities and that historical trauma, and bringing up all that information and confirming and set precedents to treatment and validate many of these arguments over time, including James Baldwin and many others. And I don't know, how do you keep the faith, because there's just so much work to be done and so many layers, to get to that point of reparations, especially if we don't have it included in education and in our history, and it's not admitted to the truths that would happen, back at that time. That's all.
I mean, in the moment we bring up reparations, like in my program, then here comes everybody else talking about reparations for their communities. It's like, we can't even have our moment. Like,
Yeah.
legislation for Black lives, but yet we've had.
But that's always the way. I mean, Black civil rights movement has always set the precedence for how America deals with other countries and cultures. And knowing that, it's always been a way of picking back and pushing movement forward, which is why the white female is much farther in things now, pushing those agendas forward under that Black civil rights movement for rights for women and, just rights, period, basically. And so how do we get away from that? Because we always seem to be the sounding card for other cultures. And, Black culture gets washed away in kind of this whitewash as if it doesn't exist anymore and we get forgotten about. And so I see why some of us are resentful and even pessimistic now that anything can be possible, because it just happens too easy and it's too often. Sorry to interrupt you, Gary.
Yeah, you see, speaking the gospel. Name.
Yes, I'd like to bring a question into the conversation, or maybe it's just an observation. Early on in the conversation, Amiri was talking about sort of the constructions of the self and the white self, and the need for in a self and other kind of model, Blackness and Black folk to be the other, to guarantee, and therefore not human, as a way of guaranteeing white humanness. And so that's a model that we're all familiar with in a variety of different contexts. It also seems to me a model that's been critiqued from a lot of perspectives, feminist perspectives, postmodern perspectives, psychedelic perspectives, more recently, ecological perspectives. And so I wonder if, I believe what I've seen in my years of, working and teaching is an increasing shift towards more complex models of the self that aren't these binary oppositions, self and other, and that are more inclusive, including of other species, flora, fauna, fungi, and the works. And I wonder if that kind of shift in consciousness is part of the work. I don't want to say necessary, but part of the work, if we're ever going to get to reparations that work for folk in more than just a surface kind of level.
You know, listening to you, Dave, I'm thinking about, you know, how Fanon situates himself in this idea of the production of the new human. You know,
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm hearing in your musing, and I think it's almost oxymoronic in the sense that if we do produce this new human, it kind of allows this notion of blackness and black identity to possibly fall by the wayside, right? And if that's the case, does reparations still have is it still necessary, right? Because now we're just not black folks, so who do you pay, right? So that's one thing that came to my mind when hearing this. But again, going back to Fanon and the production of the new human, you know, a lot of our thinkers are on that project. You know, Du Bois was into this as well. Stuart Hall talks about this also, and I think it became a project of the Black intellectual tradition almost to kind of envision this newness, because being attentive to what was and noting that what was is not working. You know what I mean? So and we're so attached to this, and we made it so fixed that you really have to produce this new type of identity to be able to move forward. You know, personally, I still don't know where I sit within that realization. I kind of like to hold on to some of the idiosyncrasies and the uniqueness of my culture, but I do understand the project, and I do understand like just the messiness of all of these things, and the messiness in the attempt of trying to produce something that this new human, right? But at the same time, I do to think about the collective whole, right? That may be a necessary step for the collective whole to move forward.
And you see my eyebrow, I got this one eyebrow that tends
when
I get suspicious of a comment. And I'll just say postmodern illusions and confusion. There's a materiality that we're talking about that regardless of, I wish, you know, a black man wasn't murdered in the United States, you know, every other day. I wish, you know, a million of us weren't, you know, having to deal with some form of the damn incarceration in some form. There's a materiality that it's just not symbolic. We're not just talking about relative truths. And so when Dr. Francis Cress Welsing says confusion is white supremacy's greatest weapon. And I would say this notion and this insistence on relative truth is adding to that confusion in serious and dangerous ways.
Thank you for your response to that. I'm mindful of, I want to say that it's Cornell West, but I think I'm wrong. It may be Homi Bhabha, who talks about that in that postmodern context, there's still the necessity for what he calls the dense particularities of our histories and of our identities. I don't know that it's an either or. That there may be ways to do both. But I see that there's other people interested in joining us. Clarence, you have some comments?
Had some comments. Well, I would first want to say I really appreciate our conversationist, because I now know what I've been suffering with. I'm slowly becoming an Afro-pessimist. With all of the research that I've done around reparations, and thanks to Antioch, I've been allowed to write paper after paper after paper, and I've did several of my academic papers around reparations. So I can really appreciate the wide spectrum of thought around the subject. I also, after hearing Monique and Amiri and Terry, I now know that, you know, it's really simple. And to borrow your last suggestion, I'm not remembering who said it now because I'm not that clear right now. I've been digesting so much and replaying my own thoughts. But when I think about, you know, the idea of trying to change the view around whiteness, And the idea that you just expressed around the idea that people don't want to be reminded of what they've done. They don't want this history to be expressed in a truthful way. And it's going to take what Monique said, it's going to take us looking at people from an individual perspective. And maybe this will help Mitch McConnell, because he said he gave y'all a Black president and that should be enough. And everyone can't get a check because you can't give LeBron one and Oprah one. But we've gone through this global pandemic where we found trillions of dollars in 3 weeks. So when that happened, Black economists said, oh, that argument about not having the money, can't find the money, can't do a paid check reparations because of we can't afford it, that went out the window immediately. So then the thought became Black people who are the descendants of slaves in America, and I'm not talking about globally, because Amiri, you know, that's a much, much, much broader complex issue. But when we just look at chattel slavery and the harms that persisted beyond, 1865, with the first reparations being given to slave owners by both England and by Lincoln to the border states. Then you got the Freedoms Bureau, which could have been, expressed as a kind of reparations. And of course, Field Order 15, which was a joke because we never got the 40 acres and a mule. But then you look down to where we are now with just trying to get a discussion in the form of a commission that's been happening since the 70s, with Connor introducing, the first plea for a commission for reparations, and now, Sheila Jackson Lee has persisted with HR 40, which can't seem to get any traction now, even after George Floyd, and the companion bill that Booker introduced in the Senate. But you also look at, like you expressed earlier, about Evanston, and in my home state, Asheville, North Carolina, local municipalities are starting to do some form of reparations to, as Hannah Nicole Brown would say, to give restitution, because I really feel at this point, reparations is about restitution. It's about actually paying for the harm that was done. And we've been able to pay the Japanese, the Chinese, the Hawaiians, and the Jewish people, which I don't even understand that part because the Holocaust happened somewhere else. I'm still trying to figure that out. But right now where I sit, I really look at the words that Monique and also some of the things that Terry just expressed. Maybe it's all got to be framed in a way that you allow white people to very gently understand they have participated in harm. And yes, it may not have been your direct harm. It may have been your great-great-great-grandfather, but you are the beneficiary of that, of all of that. And it's necessary at this point for Black people to be compensated for everything, not just chattel slavery, but every wealth building opportunity, every form of avenue to an education, every avenue that was denied to any kind of fair housing, to fair employment. All of that has been expressed by other organizations, some of which you've mentioned earlier, who've already done that work. So now it's about finding the language to sit white people down who are the power brokers to A, admit the harm, and B, take action. And it should not take 7+ years at this point, because really the work has been done. The evidence is all there. And the only way you cannot examine the evidence is to do what you just said, is to just keep confusion going on. I call it conglomeration. So, our Mr. Trump was really good at that. You start talking about apples and the whole world is needing oranges. So there you are. That's me in a nutshell. I had some other things earlier, but time is of the essence.
Clarence, homie, you should have been on the panel with us.
It's not like I didn't ask.
Oh, I didn't know. Okay, well, next time, huh?
Afro pessimist was healing for me. It allowed me to be angry and not apologize for it.
Well, I'm looking for some healing, but I feel overwhelmed with everything that's going on and why we can't just get some kind of some kind of resolve with getting closer to this work. I mean, you know, right now, all these states are trying to do this experiment they're calling basic income. Well, hell, that's what a check for reparations would be, a basic income. And yeah, if people want to spend it, and Black people are notorious for being the biggest consumers on the planet. If you just go and spend it, all it's going to do is trickle down to the capitalistic folk, and they're still going to get the benefits of it. But at least acknowledge it and pay it and do it and be done with it.
I'm looking at the chat, and Monique offered Afrofuturism as a potential that can offer healing. I would say, yeah, I think that's a great way to kind of position the opportunity for healing, because Afrofuturism is about the possibilities that can be, right? And taking account of what the present situation is and moving forward in the optimism of what the future can hold, right? So I think that would be a great place to kind of move to look for that healing, because it's all about what's to come. And that hasn't been set in stone yet, right? And that could be whatever we so choose to make it. It just makes me think of Octavia Butler's work, The Parable of the Soul and the Parable of the Talent, right? Like the destiny of Earthseed is to take root amongst the stars, right? And that is limitless potential. So I think that's a really great way of thinking about that potential for healing.
I'm a pessimist of the will, optimist of way up of the future. I don't know, but what I find enriching and fecund about optimism and futurism isn't the relationship that it could potentially bridge with non-Black people. It's what I can see the possibility it can do to bridge relationships between Black people. Because I mean, this has kind of been hit on. One of the things that's tough to digest about Afro-pessimism is its reading of Blackness. But I think it is, you know, we do have to address the anti-Blackness as it's internalized by Black people and perpetuates itself even when white people aren't present. You know, the first people to call us the N-word or to treat us like non-humans are generally within our families and communities, if we can call them that. But I think that the optimism I have in optimism and futures is in the intervention it can have between Black people, so we can start seeing ourselves not through, you know, the master's eyes, but see each other as whatever versions of human that we are creating in the world, not capital H human, lower whatever versions of ourselves, not through, you know, the masters.
Yeah, you sound like me, Terry. Low key.
Hey.
Got a little Pan-Africanist right there, a little bit. I don't know.
Hey.
I knew that was coming, Terry.
Right.
And on that note, Amiri, I'm so glad you brought up the return of the artifacts and deities that are now being returned to Africa by certain countries. But someone posted on social media the other day and they said, oh yeah, they're returning the artifacts, but they're not returning the gold, the silver, and the diamonds.
Right. Yeah, that's all staying. Yeah. We need that back too, though.
And then what value do those artifacts have if they're not in white hands? Right.
Oh, absolutely. Well, David and I are both looking at the clock, and I believe it's 5:30, and we are so very appreciative. And let's just give a hand to our conversationalists. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What a rich, wow, and a great deal of resources, very critical engagement. And I agree with everyone that's saying that this has been just from a grassroots level. And as Monique said, intellectually, we're absolutely looking at the realities, possible realities of reparations. we so appreciate the time that's been given today, and can't say enough for that. And hopefully you all will join us next week when we'll be looking at retention and race, and check your chats, great resources. So thanks again.
Real quick, Dr. Gills, before everybody log
Sure.
off, I do want to put somebody on the spot real quick. Daryl Moore, or Dr. Moore as we call him, he brought this conversation together, because if it wasn't for his seminars, I wouldn't know Terry. I wouldn't know the brilliance.
Oh, absolutely.
So
I noticed that.
Shout out Dr. Moore. If you also pay attention to the chat, he's also dropping a lot of gems in that chat as well. So big up, Dr. Moore.
Yes, I said, just very resourceful information and great ideas, and thank everyone. Set new standards today. And thank you so much, David, for facilitating. You got it all in there. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Until next time.
Till next time. Mary and Terry.